The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, a book about the time the GOP stood up to Nixon and what it says about Republicans today, plus how the alt-right is warping the American imagination. And Bill Press talks with Justin Strekal, political director of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Historian and author Michael Koncewicz tells a fascinating history of the Watergate era and reveals how Republican leaders today have little in common with those who resisted Richard Nixon. And we say hello to Michael Koncewicz, political historian and Cold War collections specialist at the Tamiment Library at NYU. He's also the author of They Said No to Nixon, Republicans Who Stood Up to the President's Abuses of Power. Michael Koncewicz, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you for having me on, Jim.
Oh, our pleasure to have you with us. You know, it's important and always good to remember that Trump is only the fourth president in American history to face impeachment. In looking at the three preceding examples, do you agree that Nixon has the closest parallels to Trump?
Each story, each impeachment story has its own unique history, but there are almost eerie parallels to between Nixon and Trump. Aside from some personal connections, the two were I think could best be described as casual acquaintances during the 1980s in New York. There's also some pretty noticeable similarities in terms of their view of the presidency and their tendency to view their opponents, their political opponents, as enemies who are trying to corrupt the nation.
Isn't that rich? It's sort of backwards, really, when you think about it.
Yeah.
But now your book puts a specific focus on how Republicans, and more specifically, Republicans within the Nixon administration, stood up to Nixon and his abuse of power. One of those, IRS Commissioner John Walters, who was told to do audits on Nixon's enemies. What did Walters do?
Johnny Walters was a Republican from South Carolina, actually first worked in the Justice Department for John Mitchell, before being named the commissioner of the IRS in 1971. And even at that point, Nixon was determined to have someone use the IRS for political purposes, someone who could audit the White House's enemies. But Johnny Walters refused to do that. And by 1972, he did so in a pretty dramatic way. Just a few months after the infamous Watergate break-in, Johnny Walters was given a list of several hundred of individuals, prominent Democrats, civil rights activists, anti-war activists, independent journalists. And the reason they were on this list was not because they had violated any real law or any regulation. They weren't even a part of an organization that had tax exempt status. What their crime was opposing Richard Nixon in one way or another. And so this, of course, was Nixon's enemies list. Then lawyer to Richard Nixon, John Dean, handed the list to Johnny Walters in September 1972. And because he viewed this as an incredibly dangerous order, Johnny Walters refused to carry it out. And fortunately for the nation, he was supported by his supervisor, then Secretary of the Treasury, George Shultz, another Republican appointee, someone who was appointed by Richard Nixon. And the two of them blocked the enemies list project, which could have further hurt the reputation of the IRS during the 1970s.
You know, it seems to me that nowadays, rather than standing up to the president, they just quit. Do you kind of get that same feeling? I mean, rather than stand up to him, they're just going to quit.
I think that's the case, and so in my book, what I showcase are the figures who want to find alternatives to that, who want to work within the system, preserve the system, and these are figures who take civil service quite seriously. They are incredibly passionate about nonpartisan civil service. They don't believe that they are operating within a political framework, and I think that's at odds with today's political climate.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's another story you write about which involves Nixon's plan to cut off funds to universities where anti-war protests were taking place. I mean, we haven't heard quite that from President Trump yet, but we're probably not far from it.
Yes, this book, for the first time, covers this particular order in great detail. This is something that very few people have discussed in public. And so what it involves is Nixon's repeated attempts to punish colleges and universities for permitting anti-war protests. So what do I mean by that? Well, after World War II, numerous colleges and universities, MIT was at the top of this list, received millions and sometimes tens of millions of dollars of Defense Department funds. This was often used for weapons-related research. And so MIT in the early 1970s was getting approximately $100 million a year for defense research. Anti-war students, interestingly enough, as some of your listeners may remember, were protesting the presence of the military on their campuses. They wanted to demilitarize the nation's campuses. What they didn't know at the time was that Nixon, in a weird way, agreed with them, but not for good ethical reasons. What he wanted to do was to punish the schools that he hated. These are liberal universities like MIT, Yale, Harvard, the University of California system, and take their Defense Department funds away and give them to schools that he thought were pro-Nixon. Now, whether or not they were pro-Nixon or not, it's beside the point. He believed that schools in the South and the Midwest were more pro-Nixon and loyal, especially to his Vietnam War policies. And so this order started off as a rant in the spring of 1970, but it popped up again. And it popped up again. And even though some of his most loyal administration officials tried to slow walk this order, by 1972, 1973, you saw real action take place. You saw people like Caspar Weinberger actually move forward with the order. And one important roadblock was that 3 assistant directors within the Office of Management and Budget, otherwise known as the OMB, blocked the order. They refused to resign. One of those assistant directors was Paul O'Neill. Later on, famously resigned from the George W. Bush administration. But these were individuals who saw this as a misuse of presidential power. They didn't want to mix politics with the distribution of federal funds, and they stopped that from happening in early 1973.
And Michael, the individuals who stood up to Nixon that you talk about, they're risking their careers. How did you understand their motivation?
Yeah, And so those 3 from the OMB, that's Paul O'Neill, but along with Kenneth Dam and William Morrill, they did risk their careers. No one knew that Nixon would end up resigning and would be seen as a disgraced president. We now look back at these decisions, and maybe some people cynically conclude that these people were just trying to benefit their careers. Well, that wasn't the case in 1972, 1973. No one knew that Nixon would have a tarnished brand coming out of Watergate. So what drove these individuals to take such a risk and put country before party was that they came up during a very different political culture. These are individuals who, even though they're Republicans and in some cases conservatives, the Republican Party on the whole had a place for good government civil servants. These were people who, even if they were conservatives like George Shultz and Johnny Walters, thought that the federal government could be used as a force for good. That has changed quite a bit in the last 45 years. And so I think what we're seeing right now is a Republican Party that is not only refusing to stand up to Donald Trump, but is also refusing to make the case for a good, honest civil service.
Well, and as you mentioned, we're not seeing the kind of bravery and resistance within the Trump administration that those individuals in the Nixon administration showed. Is that because of something unique about Trump himself, or is it also about the political climate during Nixon's time and how it's different than today?
I think it has more to do with the political climate of Nixon's time. Some of the major events of Nixon's presidency and the Watergate saga especially are shaped by the fact that the Republican Party is not a conservative party. It's made up of a conservative wing. It's made up of a moderate wing, a liberal wing. So when you don't have a totally united ideological party, that means you have much more diversity, not only in terms of ideology, but also in terms of how they view government and how they view presidential power. That has changed quite a bit over the last few decades. And what you see right now, unfortunately, and things could change, things have certainly changed in the last few weeks, but what you see right now is a party that's not just devoted to a certain understanding of conservatism, but also a pretty dangerous understanding of presidential power.
We're probably going to see a lot of things change before we're even done with this interview, if you look at the news cycle on most days. But we're speaking with Michael Koncewicz, political historian and Cold War collections specialist at the Tamiment Library at NYU, also the author of They Said No to Nixon, Republicans Who Stood Up to the President's Abuses of Power. Michael, once Watergate happens, it's now time for Congress to show its cards on Nixon. For considerable time, most Republicans were not on board with impeaching him. How do you understand their reluctance?
Well, see, this is where while there are significant differences, there are also pretty important similarities in terms of how, parties operated and related to their presidents. Republicans were still Republicans, even though the Republican Party was not the same as it is today. There was still a fair amount of party loyalty, both among voters, but especially among figures in Congress. And it's really not until the final weeks of the Watergate story that a significant number of Republicans in Congress abandoned Richard Nixon. And so that's important to know, that, history moves pretty quickly. And if you ask someone in the spring and summer of 1973, will Republicans abandon Richard Nixon? You would find very few people who would say, yes, they will abandon Richard Nixon. Still, having said that, you at least saw signs of dissent within the Republican Party, especially behind the scenes, as I cover in my book, but even in public, by the time you get to the fall of 1973, as Democrats are starting to push for impeachment, but also Republicans are starting to question the well-being of their president.
Now, the Saturday Night Massacre is a turning point for Republicans. Why was this such a significant event?
Well, it's a significant event for two reasons. One, as I argue in my book, it's the culmination of years of quiet dissent, of quiet resistance, of Republicans trying to rein in Nixon's abuses of power. And so the Saturday Night Massacre is the final chapter of my book, but in many ways it's connected to all the other quiet acts of resistance in the IRS, in the OMB, and in the Justice Department. And its central character, the central character of the Saturday Night Massacre, is Elliot Richardson, who's on the cover of my book. He, in many ways, embodied the moderate, some would even say liberal establishment wing of the Republican Party. He's a product of the Ivy League. He's a Brahmin from Boston. Would seem totally foreign to today's political culture. Someone who really, as I said, embodied the mid-20th century establishment. So why is he in the Nixon administration? Why is he the Attorney General of the United States? And this is a key difference when we're comparing 1973 to 2019. Nixon feels like he has to pick someone who will placate the so-called establishment of that era. You can hear this on the infamous Nixon White House tapes, where Nixon is telling people he doesn't fully trust Elliot Richardson, but he needs to keep him in the administration. And if he picks him to be attorney general, he has the right combination of loyalty and credibility that could carry him through a profound period of crisis.
Keep your enemies closest to you?
I think that's what he thought. And it's worth bringing up that in previous moments of crisis, Richardson had proved to be loyal. Even though he had serious reservations about Nixon's invasion of Cambodia, Richardson defended the policy. He defended the invasion in the spring of 1970. He was actually rewarded with a cabinet position as the head of HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare, in 1970 and 71. And then even though he clashed with the Nixon White House over busing, an issue that's been in the news quite a bit this year, and child care, he backs down and publicly remains loyal to Richard Nixon. And so even though Nixon gripes about Elliot Richardson on the tapes over and over again, he feels like Richardson's someone who he can control, but also can appear to be a good, honest, moderate establishment Republican to please people in the media.
Now, Michael, I want to point something out. The Washington Post said this about the book. One reason Koncewicz's narrative is so compelling is that it's also a redemption story. Who is being redeemed?
Well, at the time, the people who are being redeemed are Republicans. These are Republican civil servants. And almost all of them, even if they are concerned about Nixon's approach to the presidency, come to the conclusion that it's best for them to serve inside of the administration. It's best for them to try to create a nonpartisan climate in their offices. And they could, in most scenarios, keep Nixon's authoritarian instincts in check. This is certainly true of individuals like George Shultz and Elliot Richardson. They saw Nixon's dark side. They knew it was there, but they thought it could be controlled. What this book shows, especially when covering the Saturday Night Massacre, is that there's a breaking point. And so what the Saturday Night Massacre and the entire Watergate saga is a breaking point where these Republicans have to choose. Are they going to remain loyal to the president, or are they going to remain loyal to the country? Fortunately, they chose country over party, country over Richard Nixon. And in the end, that saved not only our democracy and helped prevent an even larger constitutional crisis, it also saved their careers, where they could look back and say, I was right to value civil service over Nixon's own cutthroat approach to politics.
And, continuing to compare this story again to Donald Trump, should we be hopeful at all that those who surround Trump in the White House and support him in Congress will challenge him in the same way as the people you write about?
I think based on the last few years, we should be skeptical of that happening. Not only among the people who surround Donald Trump, but perhaps even for the people who have voted for Donald Trump. As I said before, things can change. But whereas Nixon, we waited for the smoking gun, one could argue that with Donald Trump, there isn't going to be a smoking gun because all the crimes are happening out in public. Trump is basically, changing the landscape in terms of what's considered normal and what's an abuse of power. All of his abuses of power are quite evident if you just follow him on Twitter. And so while Nixon talked about his crimes on a secret White House recording system, they are now being broadcasted for everyone to see. This most recent story regarding Ukraine may make things different. And we'll see if this is a breaking point for Republicans. It could be that this is the moment where they decide to finally put country over party. But we have every reason to be skeptical of that happening. One very important difference is that during Watergate, especially in 1973, we had an Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, who was willing to stand up to the President of the United States. We now have an Attorney General, Attorney General Barr, who is clearly not willing to do that, and in many ways wants to act as Donald Trump's Roy Cohn, his tough guy who's able to attack his political enemies. Donald Trump, for at least the last few years, has asked, "Where is my Roy Cohn?" when he was frustrated by Jeff Sessions during his time as Attorney General. And so we're in a pretty scary period where we can't trust the Justice Department to act as a roadblock against presidential abuses of power.
Michael Koncewicz, political historian and Cold War collections specialist at the Tamiment Library at NYU. The name of the book, They Said No to Nixon, Republicans Who Stood Up to the President's Abuses of Power. Michael, I have a feeling we're going to talk about this again down the road. We want to thank you for your time with us today.
Thank you very much, Jim.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure,
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, the new face of white nationalism in the United States. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Donald Trump's idea of a good farm program seems to be hee-haw. On a recent trip to Wisconsin, he drew guffaws from the state's hard-hit dairy farmers by proclaiming that, thanks to his policies, the farm economy was looking good. We're over the hump, he gloated. Perhaps the Donald thought that farmers are rubes, unable to do simple math. But those dairy farmers were painfully aware that it cost them $1.90 to produce a gallon of milk, but the processing giants that control the milk market are paying them only $1.35 a gallon. That 55-cent a gallon loss quickly adds up to a huge loss of income and a devastating loss of farm families. Wisconsin lost 638 dairy farms last year and another 551 so far this year. Far from over the hump, farm prices have been further depressed by Trump's tariff clash with China. U.S. dairy sales to China fell by 54% in just the first half of this year. Meanwhile, monopoly power is crushing prices. An $8 billion behemoth named Dean Foods now controls 90% of Wisconsin's milk market, empowering it to commit daylight robbery, blatantly stealing farmers' product and farms. Yet, Ag Secretary Sonny Perdue, the one national official who's supposed to stand up for farmers, nonchalantly kissed them off, smugly declaring it natural that the big devour the small. So, he professes, there's nothing he can do for family operators except tell them to go out of agriculture. Jim Hightower saying, time for a change. One who is offering a path to a revitalized family farm-based food system is Senator Elizabeth Warren. Download a summary of her comprehensive proposal for a new farm economy at elizabethwarren.com/plans/new farm economy.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. For her new book, historian Alexandra Minna Stern delves into the changing landscape of white nationalism to offer an invaluable guide to a new breed of racism that threatens the most fundamental ideals of American democracy. And we say hello to Alexandra Minna Stern, who's a professor of American culture, history, women's studies, and obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Michigan. She's also the author of the prize-winning book, Eugenic Nation, Faults and Frontiers of Better Breeding in Modern America. And her most recent book, Proud Boys and the White Ethnostate, How the Alt-Right is Warping the American Imagination. Alexandra Minna Stern, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Thank you.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us today. And, you know, I think relatively speaking, the alt-right is a fairly new term. How do you define it?
The alt-right is a term that was devised by alt-righters themselves. And so some people question the use of it, saying that it's giving them too much credence to actually use that term. But I think it's helpful to use it, first because it emerged in a particular historical moment, and it also describes a pretty broad umbrella set of movements and ideas. The term itself emerged in 2008 when a philosopher, a right-wing philosopher named Paul Gottfried, used it at a talk he gave at the Minkin Club, and that talk used the term alternative right. And at that time, Richard Spencer was working as an editor for one of these webzines called Radix Journal. And so he took that term alternative right and shortened it to alt-right. And so if we look at it in the context of 2008, it really captures that moment in which the various strands that we associate with the alt-right were coming together, whether it was neo-Nazis, white nationalists, white separatists, the misogynists associated with pickup artists and men going their own way, as well as those connected to anti-immigration movements and so on. So that's why I think it's important to know what the term is and to be able to really kind of contextualize it and unpack it.
Sure. Now, your book describes the intellectual history of this movement, making it clear that many of its ideas are hardly new. Rather, they're being rehabilitated. What are some of the intellectual roots of this movement?
There are a few streams that feed into the contemporary alt-right and white nationalism. To some extent, you know, there's good old American racism, deep-seated anti-immigration discourse. There also are elements, though, that to some extent have resonances more in Europe, or at least in the European strands of nationalism that have been incorporated into contemporary white nationalism in the U.S. And those relate to patriarchy, neo-fascist ideas of order and time, and also some ideas related to the need to protect the environment from overpopulation and from immigration. So I guess one of the ways, you know, I think this is kind of old wine in new bottles, but the bottles are also different than they were before. And this movement is very much connected to the rise of social media and the way in which our whole media ecosystem has changed, and that interplay between, you know, the social media realm and then what's happening in real life, where sometimes those work to the favor of white nationalism and sometimes it's more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned, you know, internet, social media, and its role in the rise of the alt-right. You describe it as an accelerant. What's an example of how the alt-right has essentially weaponized social media.
There are so many examples there. I mean, I would say on the one hand, there are examples that relate to how the alt-righters or white nationalists themselves seized upon different tropes and were able to meme the heck out of them to their advantage. And an example of that would be what happened with Pepe the Frog around the 2016 election, and how all of the kind of riffs and mashups around that acquired almost a life of their own. Another reason, though, is it serves as an accelerant, is that the way that these platforms were set up, they were like a Facebook platform or a YouTube platform, was really to often direct users to the most intense and often the most kind of disturbing of content. So that things that would be, algorithmically made available, or videos that would be kind of upvoted on different platforms, were those that would lead, even, an unsuspecting person who wanted to know what it meant to be red-pilled would lead them, down the rabbit hole to places like the Daily Stormer or the David Duke Show, or really what is kind of that harder edge of white nationalism today.
The interesting thing with the alt-right, bringing some new spin to some of these weathered tropes, one of them is called eco-fascism. What is the connection here between environmental concerns and fascist ideology?
Yeah, so that idea of eco-fascism has been around for quite some time, and to some extent it harkens back to these earlier historical precedents that we were talking about before. So you can find elements of kind of a veneration of nature and nature for, kind of the folk, or kind of blood and soil ideology, as you saw in Nazi Germany. These ideas were around in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. More recently, though, with, concerns over climate change and large numbers of refugee populations, as we've seen in Europe, and also, kind of attempts to control asylum seekers on the U.S.-Mexico border. There are some among white nationalists, and those include both the shooter in Christchurch and the shooter in El Paso, who actually took that term. They claimed it for themselves and said, quote, "I am an eco-fascist," end quote, because what they think is that the planet needs to be saved, but the planet needs to be saved for white people and for Europeans. And it's all the brown and black people that are causing all the problems, that are leading to overpopulation, that are polluting, what could be a pristine country, and are, disrupting what should be the status quo. So I think this term eco-fascism, I think this phenomenon of eco-fascism is something that we're likely to see more and more of among nationalist camps. Another trope that they use is welcome the bees, not the refugees, or, save the trees, not refugees. So really this focus on kind of protecting nature for white people only.
Oh, such lovely people. Another aspect of the alt-right that you write about is its desire to actually distance itself from more visible groups, such as KKK and the Nazis. This is in the interest of normalizing, if you will, their ideas and making them more acceptable to the mainstream. Is that strategy working?
I would say that strategy is working to some extent. So if we go back to the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about the alt-right as kind of a broad umbrella term. Underneath that umbrella is a motley crew of a range of different kind of people and ideas. And so it's not, the neo-Nazis are rubbing shoulders with the identitarians, or those who might have a more sanitized kind of self-presentation, but still the same ideologies. So it depends on how far you dig. Once you pull kind of the various layers off the onion, you will eventually get to, kind of neo-Nazism or neo-fascism of some sort. However, I would say that, some of these more recent groups, they are very attentive to the need to repackage themselves, and they know that to sell their ideas, they can't be using swastikas or evoking Ku Klux Klan type imagery. So instead they opt for what would be more of a 21st century kind of what they called fasci for fascist look, with wearing khaki pants and, crew cut hairstyles, and also learning how to use the right words that are edgy enough to kind of position themselves in terms of their politics, but not scary enough to turn people off. So some of that language, and this is why it's so important to look at how the kind of terrain of language has changed and how it's been really reshaped. I mean, it's quite striking to think over the past several years how language and what is acceptable in political discourse has shifted because of the alt-right and also because of the Trump presidency. And some of those terms would be terms such as red pilling, which I mentioned before, social justice warriors or SJWs, the idea of incels. So there are all these terms that are part of kind of this lexicon of the alt-right, so to speak. And so insofar as we recognize those and we understand them, I would say that they have made inroads and that some of them are very good at normalization. And so I'm really interested in that phenomenon of what we might call alt-right creep into the mainstream and the damage it's doing in terms of corroding American democracy.
And I automatically think back to the term you used a few minutes ago, and it's old wine in a new bottle. I mean, they're just calling it something different, but the reality is it's still sympathizing with KKK and Nazi thinking.
It is, although it's really important to note that, there is a difference between white supremacy and white nationalism. So white supremacy is apartheid South Africa, is Jim Crow America, where you have, it's a colonialist formation where you have a small number of whites or even majority whites, but they're ruling over, others or what they perceive to be racial others. White nationalism in the 21st century, some of those kind of at the forefront of this movement, they don't want to rule over brown and black people. They want to have their own ethno-state. They want to have their own territory because then they can call the shots and they can have what they like to refer to as a, quote, homogenous homeland, end quote. So they actually view this idea of the white ethno-state in terms of compassion, like, well, we just want we just want to do white identity politics and, have our own ethno-states, and the blacks can have their own ethno-states and the Latinos can have their own ethno-state, and so on. So I think it's important to note what that distinction is because that resonates both in the U.S. and also in Europe. And I would mention that, kind of this new wave of nationalists in the U.S., ethno-nationalists, they are very connected to what's going on in Western and Eastern, and also Southern Europe. So kind of like almost all of Europe, as well as in India and Brazil and other parts of the world. So there's a transnational dynamic to this that is very important and that also is facilitated by the social media networks that they've constructed.
We're speaking with Alexandra Minna Stern, professor of American culture, history, women's studies, and obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Michigan. Her latest book, Proud Boys and the White Ethno-State, How the Alt-Right is Warping the American Imagination. Alexandra, you used the word ethno-state in your title. This comes at a time when demographic changes in the United States are eroding the majority status of white people. Does the alt-right have concrete ideas of how to create ethno-states, even as the nation becomes more diverse?
Yes and no. On the one hand, the ethno-state is kind of a pipe dream that is bandied about in chat rooms and on the internet as kind of the ideal, what the ideal future would look like. It's both a future vision and harkens back to a nostalgic past, a nostalgic American past, like circa 1950s or 1960s. But I did find in my research, some examples of almost how-to manuals on how to create the white ethno-state. And this is what's pretty striking. If you look at what the strategies are for creating a white ethno-state, a lot of those strategies involve harsh immigration laws and policies. So making it more difficult to obtain asylum, revoking birthright citizenship, ideally retroactively, tightening the bar for both for legal immigration and basically building a wall on the border to stop illegal, to stop undocumented immigration. So if you look at what some of the ideas are to build the ethno-state, they actually resonate with what's going on in this country right now. Now, I don't think that, there's necessarily a really tight one-on-one correspondence there, but it speaks to our particular moment and the way in which, xenophobia is a core value of white nationalists. And it's also been, at the forefront of Trump's agendas and policies, even if he hasn't been able to operationalize them, at least, through Congress in the way that he would have wanted to. So, yeah, the ethno-state is, that's why I put it in the title, obviously, is I think that it's a really important concept for understanding what white nationalism looks like in 2019. And I also put Proud Boys in the title, referring both to the organization, the Proud Boys, and also to signal that misogyny and homophobia and transphobia are absolutely central to the genesis of the alt-right and, basically the contours of what white nationalism looks like today.
You mentioned Donald Trump. Would it be accurate to describe the relationship between Trump and the alt-right as symbiotic?
Yes, I would call it symbiotic. It's inconsistent. It's symbiotic. They're constantly reverberating between each other. So what's interesting is that, you've had opinion columnists in the New York Times who basically called out Donald Trump as a white supremacist. And yes, some of the things that he said, and certainly aspects of his immigration policies, which are heinous and cruel, definitely resonate with white nationalism or white supremacy. But at the same time, if you follow white nationalists online and you follow their manifestos, many of them don't like Trump because they feel like he basically has, sold out. He's too much in bed with the, Republican Party and partisan politics. He never built the wall. He never followed through on many of his promises. So it's interesting if you follow some of their blogs and webzines and kind of Twitter feeds or go into Gab or 4chan or some of these other places, what you will see is that they're just as interested in someone like Tulsi Gabbard or, Andrew Yang, who have these kind of not quite understandable populist ideas about kind of wealth distribution, or they're intense like isolationists or protectionists. So the alt-right likes some aspects of Donald Trump, but they certainly, will shop around to look at other political figures heading into 2020 to see who catches their eye and whose policies would seem to be the most effective for their own agenda of building an ethno-state and, really kind of shoring up white identity.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we let you go, what do you see as some of the most effective ways to fight the alt-right? I mean, does it make sense to try to de-radicalize its members, or should the focus be more on making ourselves immune to its message?
Well, I think it's hard I think that's a good question, and it's always a hard one to answer because, the ideas are moving targets and everything is happening in such a fast-paced media environment that is also, fragmented into so many different pieces, and there's so many different echo chambers. But I would say a few things. The first is to, from my perspective as a scholar, is to be able to understand, as I mentioned before, the lexicon of white nationalism. What is it? What terms are they using? What memes are they using? Let's be aware of them and let's be able to decode them, just like they have thousands of dog whistles. So what are those dog whistles and how are they being used and how are they creeping into mainstream conversation? That's one thing. Another is that, it's pretty much been demonstrated that deplatforming of right-wing figures works. It kind of enfeebles them and it cuts off their, biggest source of power, which are their users and their likers and their followers and those who were able to amplify their messages. And that is the case with Alex Jones and also with Milo Yiannopoulos, Gavin McInnes, and others who've been deplatformed. So I think we need to all learn more about the role of social media and be aware of the benefits of deplatforming, even as, we're cognizant of the importance of kind of having, a country where kind of free speech and free expression is supported.
The name of the book, Proud Boys and the White Ethno-State, How the Alt-Right is Warping the American Imagination. Alexandra Minna Stern, thank you very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. You as well. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press on the rise of legalized marijuana. Who's buying in and who's pushing back?
When NORML started in 1970, there was 12% support for legalized recreational use of marijuana. What is it today? It's gotten a little better, hasn't it?
It's much higher. We're very fortunate. As the public is continuing to engage on this issue, we are now seeing 68% of Americans supporting the outright legalization and regulation
across
of adult
the board.
use. Majorities of Democrats, majorities of independents, and since 2017, majorities of Republicans.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how many states now have moved to, we're talking recreational use of marijuana, to make it legal?
Well, we like to say responsible adult use.
Thank you.
But recreational
I like that.
works too, because I enjoy it. We are now at 11 states in the District of Columbia have legalized the responsible adult possession and consumption of marijuana. Vermont and D.C. have not set up a regulated marketplace, so it's legal to grow your own, but you can't go to a store and buy it yet. And then 33 states and the District of Columbia have legalized the medical use of marijuana with a doctor's recommendation.
So are all of those in those states so far by initiative, not by legislation?
All but two. Vermont became the first state to legislatively depenalize marijuana. That's what I mean when I say it's legal to grow and possess and consume. And then just earlier this year, Illinois became the first state to legislatively legalize and set up a regulated marketplace.
Right.
So we expect Illinois' marketplace, you'll be able to travel to the land of Lincoln and buy marijuana next year.
And Colorado was number one, correct?
Well, Colorado and Washington. Colorado's
Washington.
Election results got called first, but Washington did the same day.
Yeah. So, we heard ahead of time, of course, we've heard such fear tactics against the use of marijuana for years and years and years. But we heard, particularly in Colorado and Washington, all these horror stories about what might happen, what would happen, right? What has happened? I mean, let's talk, for example, people said this is going to be an increase in violent crime.
We have not seen an increase in violent crime. I've dug through the crosstabs of crime data coming out of Colorado. There was one blip where arson went up by 50% because that's in a comparing time periods from there were 2 instances to there were 3 instances. Other than that, we see crime down across the board, and that's part of just, the state of Colorado growing a more vibrant and strong economy that are addressing the issues of Coloradans. which is including legal marijuana and the investments that it's making into public education through the additional tax resources.
We also heard there's going to be a lot of driving while stoned, right? A lot of arrests driving while stoned.
There have been an uptick in the documented cases of impaired consumption on marijuana, but it's important to recognize that when Colorado legalized, they changed the way that they determine impairment, and they changed the way that they conduct drug testing on the roads. It used to be whenever there was a highway fatality, the arresting officer at the scene would make a determination as to whether or not they do a drug test. Now they do one every time. So a lot of
they're going to get more.
Absolutely, it's like you're going fishing versus dragging the pond with a net. And, so we have seen an uptick in the number of correlated incidences. Mm-hmm. So a lot of our opponents like to say, paint this image that the highways of Colorado run red with the blood of the innocent. But in real numbers, overall highway fatalities have gone down per capita. So the streets of Colorado are safer today than they were before they legalized marijuana.
And, of course, one of the big arguments was that just rampant teenage use, right? This is going to get into the schools, grade schools, middle schools, high schools. Yeah. Any evidence of that? No,
absolutely none. In fact, we now have state-issued reports that show that teen use rates is either staying consistent prior to legalization or slightly declining. What we are seeing is a huge decline in the perceived access to marijuana. And that's because we're taking marijuana out of the hands of the street corner dealers and we're putting it behind counters where, the business checks someone's ID. So, we're now seeing, I remember I was in high school just 15 years ago. It was easier to get marijuana than it was to get alcohol. And it's that same kind of concept because we're putting in mechanisms of control.
Do you have any numbers on whether or not in the adult population there are more people now enjoying marijuana because it is legal and it's accessible?
Yeah. No, there is an increase in reported consumption, and the largest increase is actually among the senior population. And I'm sure you and I may agree on this, but the majority of seniors actually oppose the legalization of marijuana. But we're seeing in states where it's reforming that now that it's no longer against the rules, now the greatest generation is willing to say, you know what, if it's not illegal, I'll try it.
Yeah,
and they're trying it and they're enjoying it. And now in these regulated marketplaces, they can get teas, they can get creams for their arthritis.
Mm-hmm.
Consumption comes in a lot of forms.
And they vote.
Right,
yes. Right. So the uptick, I guess, of course, has been revenue, particularly for the states. Is that across the board that we've seen? I've heard the stories about Colorado. Tell us about that.
No, all the states are levying a sales tax in various points of the whole scale of production. But, it is a sizable amount of money. In Colorado, they're reinvesting it into the schools. Other states are choosing to do different things with the tax revenue. One of the things that we think is really important is that some of that tax revenue be used to expunge the criminal records of those who have had marijuana offenses that prevent them from getting things like jobs and access to housing and health care, et cetera. So there's a lot of things that these states can do, and especially at a time when we see state revenues so just so craving money these days.
Right.
A lot to invest in. In Colorado, Governor Jared Polis, probably the most pro-marijuana reform governor in the country, is ecstatic to announce every time that there's a new school that's being reconstructed or built with marijuana money.
Right. Is there any parallel effort in these states? You mentioned some of the people who are, particularly a lot of young people, a lot of young black kids in prison for long terms because of marijuana use. Now that the marijuana is legal, has there been any parallel effort for sentencing reform and get some of these people out of jail?
There is, and it is growing in momentum, and it's growing in power and growing in effectiveness. When the states of Colorado and Washington legalized, they didn't prioritize those kind of reparative justice elements. In fact, when the state of Washington first legalized, you were unable to get a job sweeping the floor at a dispensary if you had a marijuana possession charge on your record. Absolutely absurd. But there were political calculations made at the time, and now it's a very different political climate to make those kind of calculations. And that's why we saw when Illinois legalized, they voted to automatically expunge the criminal records of every single person who had a nonviolent marijuana conviction. And we think that's incredibly important. And we're also seeing a big movement that's growing, particularly spearheaded by a few organizations like the Minority Cannabis Business Association, to prioritize access to avenues into the industry for work and for ownership of dispensaries and the whole new economy that's growing for the exact same communities that have been targeted under the racist enforcement of criminalization.
So this certainly opened up enormous new opportunities for businesses to get people to get into the marijuana business, let's say. Give us some idea of what's the nature of that business. Are we talking about small business? We're talking about mom and pop operations?
It depends on the regulatory environment of the market we're talking about. I mean, a lot of these states have gone dramatically different routes when it comes to the issuances of licensing. For example, in West Virginia, their medical program, just to be considered for the privilege of obtaining a license for a dispense or for a cultivation facility, it's a $50,000 non-refundable application fee.
Whoa.
So I don't know a whole lot of small businesses and entrepreneurs who have $50,000 cash on hand just to roll the dice. You know, the guys like that, who are rolling the dice on that kind of money are going to Vegas. So it's not the mom and pop shops. I think it's incredibly important that we recognize as we reform marijuana policy that it's a commodity. And just like any other business, we need to have sense of regulations and controls, but we don't need to regulate it like it's plutonium. And some of the barriers to entry have just been, completely unscalable for entrepreneurs.
And some of the criticism we hear is that consequently it's tough for, again, a really small business mom pop operation or people of diversity, people of color to get in this business.
Yeah. Now, marijuana reform will not solve systemic racism. I mean, marijuana reform alone can't undo the history of redlining or Jim Crow or segregation. But it can be a point to address those issues. And we're seeing programs that are attempting to do so through what's called equity licensing in places like Oakland and LA and others, where they are trying to prioritize to ensure that impacted communities get at least a percentage of the licenses that are issued. But unfortunately, those programs are being constrained by the practical realities of federal prohibition, which includes, lack of access to capital. Because right now, every single marijuana business owner is a felon, the degree of a heroin dealer under the eyes of the federal government, kingpins, if you will. So banks are not able to issue credit. So if you don't have capital, like cash on hand in a duffel bag, ready to go pay your, contractors, ready to pay your workers, then you can't play in the market.
I was just going to get to that because there's this built-in hurdle for them, right? Yeah. That they are considered felons just by opening this business. So how is that an entire offline, if you will, underground economy in terms of where do they keep the revenue they get? How do they pay their employees?
Yeah.
How do they pay their bills?
Yeah.
How do they pay their taxes? Or do they pay taxes if they're criminal enterprise?
They are paying. Most of them are paying their taxes. There's this tax penalty known as 280E, and it's essentially the same policy of how they got Al Capone, saying if you are profiting off of a Schedule I controlled substance, you still have to pay your taxes. Bless the IRS, they crossed all the T's to make sure that they could charge drug dealers with an extra crime. So, but what we're seeing is these companies, they have to pay all their taxes, but they don't get standard business deductions because it's an illegal product. So they're not getting the same kind of incentives that every other business gets to provide health care for their employees. They're not getting the same kind of write-offs for capital improvements, bringing on veterans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, of which we do so much of our incentives through with nudges. And right now they're just not able to. Senator Merkley actually tagged along with the cannabis business as they were going to pay their taxes, and the IRS sets up different points around the state at different times a year to be collection centers.
This is in the state of Oregon.
This is in the state of Oregon, where they wouldn't tell the cannabis business until just the day before, because they were coming in with duffel bags full of cash. And that's one of the biggest complaints I hear from state lawmakers when that they're considering putting in regulated marketplaces, saying, how are we supposed to know what these businesses are doing? They're not a part of our integrated economy. And that's just one of the many issues we need to address through federal policy.
So the big hurdle still is, despite the success at the state level, the big hurdle is that marijuana is still classified as a Schedule I drug by the federal government, which means it's addictive and has zero medical advantage, right?
Yep. No,
and
it's that simple.
What's the prognosis for changing that?
Well, the prognosis for removing marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act is not great as long as the Senate Majority Leader is Mitch McConnell. He has expressed absolutely no interest in addressing the scheduling of marijuana. But ironically, just last year, he shepherded the descheduling of marijuana as long as it has 0.3% THC or less, what we refer to as hemp. But the CSA now says marijuana, as long as it has 0.3% or less, is legal, 0.4% or more, illegal. He's shown no interest in changing that. Now, he is one of the most effective legislators of our time, right, or in history.
Sadly,
say what you will about him, and I got a lot to say on a different topic, but no, perhaps he'll see that the political winds are changing, and he will change his calculation. But he has made no intention that he's made no indication that he will. But there are some technical fixes, some little tweaks here and there that he might be amenable to, such as addressing that banking issue that we mentioned just a moment ago, where, because it would not only help the cannabis companies, but it would also help provide some certainty to the hemp markets. And the hemp markets is something that Mitch McConnell champions for the farmers in Kentucky to bring back some jobs to his state.
Well, there is some progress along that line in the House recently.
Yes. No, the House of Representatives are leading the way right now. We just had a vote a couple weeks ago that was 321 to 105. And it was, 103. Right, yeah. It was a really, really strong showing. All but one Democrat voted in favor of it. 91 Republicans voted for it, and the independent Justin Amash. And what this bill would do is just essentially create what we refer to as a safe harbor for banks that choose to engage in business with marijuana companies. So it's not a panacea. It's not going to solve all the problems, but it would, if enacted, would allow local banks would mainly get into it. I don't think Wells Fargo or Bank of America want to mess with the Controlled Substances Act, but local regional banks and credit unions who desperately need to bring more clients in would look to this.
But that's huge. Yeah. I mean, that's a huge victory for the cannabis community, if you will, and for the pot caucus in the House of Representatives, which is
Cannabis Caucus.
The Cannabis Caucus, which is growing in numbers. I know many members of it, and I'm sure this is something they've been working for a long time.
Yes. Now we had such an incredibly diverse coalition of members of Congress and of groups pushing this bill. I did not expect to see the American Bankers Association at our weekly meetings, but they were, and they really helped us get it over the finish line for for this very narrow legislation. But this narrow legislation legitimizes the retail sale of marijuana in America, and that to that point, 45% of the Republican caucus, nearly 100% of the Democratic caucus in the House, all voted to legitimize the retail sale of marijuana.
Yeah,
that's pretty remarkable.
Bill Press talking with Justin Strekal, political director of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressShow.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Michael Koncewicz, Alexandra Minna Stern, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.